All right. I hope this audience is not a messenger killer type audience. I'm a bearer of some really bad news. So I'm just reporting the situation. I didn't cause it. So I have been known to have a tendency toward doom and gloom. At least my friends say that. I always thought I was a pretty good-natured person. But the reality has far surpassed my gloom. And that's what we'll be talking about. Some years ago, I used to say the biggest surprise of my life was that I never thought I'd end up living under fascism. But it happened. And then, but recently I've been saying the biggest surprise, other than having lived this long, is to come to the belief that there's a possibility that the earth and all life on it will die within 50 years. So that's what I'm talking about. So by way of introduction, I want to explain how I got involved in this. And I got invited to the Cambridge Conference on Emergency Congress on Climate Change. Okay, right here, climate change. This is a euphemism already. It's not climate change, it's global warming. So this whole thing about climate change can mean anything, and we've always said climate change. But global warming is different. I mean, if they're going to say climate something, it should be climate disruption or something like that. So climate change is already a liberal cop-out. So I went to the Congress in Cambridge, and I got started looking into this issue. It was a side issue for me. I hope this is the last thing I deal with on climate change. I got other things to do. But I got into it, and I wrote up an essay, a little essay. And the first version went into the BAM newsletter. And then that was in December of 2009. And then I kept working on the issue for another 6 months. And I wrote up a long substantive appendix, and that got published in Anarcho-Syndicalist Review. Front page. I got on the cover. So I haven't published much stuff, but that was my friend John who edits this. He said, James, it was a little. In terms of anarchist writing on this, there are almost none. Peter Gelderloos, who was through here a few months ago, he had a couple of early pieces called Before the Big Change and Peter, Capital Solutions for Global Warming, More Wood for the Fire. And and I have this list. This is in its bibliography here. Just a small list of anarchists who have written on this issue. Andrew Flood has a very short piece, but there are a couple nice zines. The COP15 zine crew dealt with green capitalism, dealing with distractions. And then there's anonymous group put out called Introduction to the Apocalypse, 68-page pamphlet about this issue. It's even more dramatic than mine. But anyway, I think I've got the skinny on global warming right here. So I think from the anarchist point of view, this is one of the best things so far. Anybody know where I got the skinny came from? If we have all these phrases, we have to look this. Monica and I were trying to figure out up to snuff where that came from. I went to my bookcase full of references, like encyclopedias. She went to the internet. Who won? I win a lot of the time, but some of the more recent things. Jeff said one day, the average human eats 12 spiders a year. Come on, Jeff, that's not true. So we did a little research, and it turned out there was a website on spider myths, urban. Okay, that's beside the point, right? All right, we're gonna jump to the dirty. I don't know where that expression. Okay, here's what. I'll start out with the worst, and then I'll try to back up and how I came to that conclusion. So what are our prospects? This is just a paragraph. I'm going to read it. So what are our prospects? Realistically speaking, we're fucked. 10, 15, or 20 years will go by in a flash. Business as usual will prevail. The oil, gas, and coal companies will not be reined in. The lumber companies that are cutting down the rainforest for profit will not be stopped. Corporate controlled governments will not take action. The sheer inertia of a worldwide capital civilization built on cheap fossil fuel energy will keep the vast machine grinding inexorably on until the tipping point is reached, after which the irreversible warming of the earth will begin in earnest from natural causes. That will be the end of us. That will be the end of the line for us. Okay, that's the dirty. And so then we'll back up and see what I tried to do. That was the end of my my December essay. So then I kept looking into it, and I tried to find a little wiggle room. Is this really true? I mean, what are the timelines? Are they firm? And so that's what I did in the second time. So here's the outline of my talk. A little background on the treaty, the global warming treaty, then a few relevant facts, and then the key thing, the tipping points. We'll talk about the tipping points. And then the causes of global warming, and then the three forces that might be possible to stop it. Governments, local initiatives, global justice movement. So I'll evaluate those three. And then try to say what I think it would actually take to stop it, and whether that's possible, how possible. So that's it. The tipping points is the key thing. I might get that out right now because that's what the whole approach is based on, that we're going to pass tipping points. And the timeline is 20 to 30 years. And if we pass those tipping points, there'll be no stopping global warming. And it will just escalate, and the Earth will become like Venus. There's a chapter in James Hansen's book on the Venus syndrome, although he doesn't put the dates quite as drastic. I ordinarily wouldn't go against his judgment. So I'll explain that. Okay, the background of this whole thing is in 1992, because of climate scientists were starting to sound the alarm, they had this conference in Rio de Janeiro, and they worked up a treaty called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And to date, 192 nations have signed on. The United States went to this conference, and they started disrupting things from the very beginning and have continued to do so ever since. Although they did sign this, the Rio Treaty, it's called. But they had the original treaty was much stronger than what ended up with because of objections from the United States. So that's what's happening. Every year they have a conference called the Conference of Participants, and we're up to COP16, that was in Cancun. The one I wrote up was COP15 in Copenhagen last December. So then 5 years later, in Kyoto, Japan, 1997, the signatures to the treaty got together, and they wanted to write a binding treaty for binding reductions. So to put some teeth into it. So that's what we're talking about. And Al Gore flew to this conference and demanded that a Wall Street scheme, cap and trade with offsets, be the basis for the reducing the emissions, and he succeeded. And then the United States didn't even sign the Kyoto Protocol. So the United States is not even a signature to the Kyoto Protocol, and that becomes relevant later because of what's happened in Copenhagen. And okay, now, so I'll set the relevant facts out. Most of you know that carbon dioxide is the main the main global warming, gas, and there are others, like you have methane at 14%, nitrous oxide 8% of the greenhouse gases, and then carbon dioxide is 56%. So that's a sort of breakdown. Methane is supposedly unstable in the atmosphere, and it changes rapidly into carbon dioxide. So now, if we take the greenhouse gases generated by just to focus on the CO2, that's what everyone does. Most of that comes from burning coal, and that was new for me. I thought I just wasn't aware of that. 41% of electricity. Okay, so let's ask where does CO2 come from by sector of the economy? This is another surprise to me because I just assumed it was from automobiles, trucks, transportation. Actually, transportation is only 12% of CO2. Commercial buildings is 8%. So all of this stress on greening the buildings is most of the CO2 comes from the generating electricity. That's 25%. Industry is 19%, and agriculture. So these are the big engines of CO2. This is really important because where you focus on to stop it. Okay, let's ask geographically where does it come from? And here I did a little something a little new because everybody says the United States is the biggest producer of CO2. Well, that's only if you don't look at Europe as a whole. And Europe has been toting their union for a long time, right? So they list Germany and England and France separately. So if you add up Europe, Europe is. So in 2008, here's the breakdown. China, 22%, the biggest. Europe, 20%, next biggest. United States, 17%. But I included Russia in Europe, so I think Russia should be included in Europe. But so if you take that as a unit, it's a big thing. Historically, Europe is even worse. They've generated 38%, and the U.S. at 27%, China at 9%. So historically, it's mainly Europe. Another thing we need to keep in mind is when we talk about degrees, it's always in Celsius. So 1 degree Celsius equals 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. So a 1 degree increase, and so if you're talking about 2 degrees increase, we have to keep that in mind because Fahrenheit's a lot more. Another interesting fact about the temperature is that it's not evenly distributed over the Earth. So it's more in some places. Excuse me. In the last years, I've had a cough, among many other things. The cough is the least. So, and this is what's happening is that in the north, it's 5 degrees. What's happened is that the Earth has a fever. It's out of balance, temperature-wise. It's absorbing more heat than it gets rid of. It's always been balanced, but now it's 0.7 degrees, 0.7 hot, and it's going up towards 1 degree. So, if you look at geographically, Europe, the USA, and China produce 60%. So even if these big blocks went back to zero, that would still leave 40% from the rest of the world. And so this is a global problem. I don't know how, actually this might not take all that long. I hope everybody seems to hanging in so far. All right, the tipping points. This is the key thing. For me, anyway. There are 5 of them. Death and destruction of the rainforest, ocean acidification, melting snow and ice, ocean warming, and the thawing of the frozen tundra in Siberia and northern Canada. And death and destruction of the forest. Some scientists are saying that if the temperature goes up much more, they'll just die. There seems to be a limit. We don't know yet, and even if they don't die from being too hot, they claim that they're right at the upper limit of their ability to deal with temperature. Most species have a range, but even if they don't die, the forests are being cut down at an incredible rate. I have the statistics in here on the countries that are losing the most. And forests are a carbon sink. They take carbon dioxide out of the air. And the ocean is a carbon sink. It takes carbon dioxide out of the air. But it's reaching its limit as to how much it can. And when it does that, it acidifies. And so this is a huge problem because acidification kills the phytoplankton, and phytoplankton are a major source of oxygen for us, for the atmosphere, and also they oxygenate the ocean. So, and then the quantity of phytoplankton in the oceans is already down 40%, a huge drop just in the last few decades because of acidification. So, and then the third thing is the melting snow and ice, and this is the most visible part. It's happening all over the world. It has dramatic effects because a couple billion people in Asia depend upon glaciers for fresh water. There's a good video on YouTube on melting of the ice sheet in Greenland. It's going much faster than anyone thought, and they now think it can disintegrate within a few decades instead of a century. That's because the temperature increase in Greenland is 5 degrees, not 1 degree. 5 degrees Celsius, that's 10 degrees practically. So then the estimates are what happens to sea level vary. I've never been able to get a good one. I went with the worst. One paper I read, which seems solid, said that if all the ice on the Earth, all the ice and snow melts, the sea rise will be 250 feet. So that just wipes out most coastal cities and all the lowlands and everything. It's huge. But that, I don't know. I'm skeptical about that. Most of them are much less, 25, 30 feet. But even 30 feet would wipe out South Bay. Okay, now the two tipping points that I've focused on are the ones that would kill the Earth. They're ocean warming and thawing of the frozen tundra in Siberia and Canada. Why are they have the potential to kill the Earth? Because of the release of methane. There are billions of tons of methane gas stored in the frozen tundra and also in the oceans. They're called methane hydrates, or frozen ice thing, globules under the sea. And along the entire Arctic coastland of Siberia, there's this very shallow shelf, continental shelf. It's just 50 feet deep or 100 feet deep, and it is loaded with methane. So if the temperature rises, that methane is going to be released. And once that process gets going, it's self-perpetuating. So this is what frightens the daylights out of me and a lot of people. So this is a key thing, and the whole argument of my paper and others that are doing this depends on this methane release. Is it going to happen? How fast is it going to happen? And so forth. And once it starts, it feeds upon itself. It makes the atmosphere warmer and releases more methane, so that very rapidly the atmosphere would become just poisonous, and the Earth would become like Venus. All life on Earth would be destroyed. So that's the task we face of how to stop this. Okay, that's the tipping points. Now we get to the fun part, the causes of global warming. This is so discouraging because, with very few exceptions, capitalism is just not even part of the picture. Many of you maybe saw that Al Gore's film about this sometime. What was that called? What? Yeah, I saw that. Didn't mention corporations once. No mention of corporations. And then the solution was to change your light bulbs. Well, in this book, he missed, well, it's a little more difficult than just lifestyle changes. We have to have some policy changes too, but it's still totally capitalist. Now, I won't get into the non-human reasons. There are people who argue that sunspots are causing it. But the consensus is CO2, and James Hansen, I asked him this question. I got up the nerve to ask a question. And he just shot it down. They have solid scientific data that the sunspots are not correlated with the CO2. The CO2 that we're facing is more dramatic than anything that happened in history, especially in the short time period that we're facing. So it's true that earlier civilizations destroyed the environment, and you can say, well, it's not just capitalism, it's civilization. But there's some differences. Like, first of all, it wasn't part of the internal logic of the system. I mean, they cut down the forest, that's true. But with capitalism based on profit, accumulation of capital, it's built in. You have to get the resources, you have to find new markets, and you have to externalize the cost, and so this is the internal dynamic. Plus, earlier civilizations weren't doing it with modern industrial technology. I mean, they didn't have this, it was nothing on the scale that we have now. Plus, they weren't global civilizations. Capitalism is a global civilization, and it's everywhere. So, so my paper is based on the claim that capitalists cause global warming. It's not just the oil companies. It's everything. It's the lumber companies and the whole idea that profit takes priority over life itself. And we saw it in the Gulf of Mexico just recently. I mean, it's a horrible thing. I mean, they were willing to kill the Gulf of Mexico in order to preserve the viability of their company. And they shortchanged all the safety measures. They cut corners. And I followed that pretty closely. Okay, so this is what I claim. Capitalists have caused global warming. It's true that initially and for a long time thereafter, capitalists didn't know that they were doing this, but they could damn well see that they were destroying the environment, and they didn't care, and they still don't, any more than they cared about the millions of people they were killing, and still are. Capitalists are not going to stop global warming. They are still and always will be bickering and jockeying and fighting among themselves for position, power, markets, resources, and profits. Now, if you reject this claim, which virtually everyone does, you're left with all kinds of stuff. Okay, so I'll go to, I'm going to consider now the three causes, the three possible forces that could stop global warming. There are three of them: governments, local initiatives, and the global justice movement. I'm breezing through this talk. I'm not going to take on it. We'll have a lot of time for you all to come after me. Okay, the governments. Okay, that's the treaty, the Cancun. All the governments get together, and now we have to have two conceptual clarifications here. The whole debate, dialogue, approach is based upon the developmental framework. The Rio Treaty of 1992 divides countries into poor and rich. This is totally erroneous. And the most of the language is the developed countries and the developing countries, and they're squabbling on who has to cut most and can give benefits to the developing countries. Okay, here's what's wrong with this. The world is not divided into developing and developed countries. It's divided into imperial and colonial or neo-colonial countries. So their whole framework for analyzing the problem is wrong from the beginning. Every country has an elite which is more or less integrated into the world capitalist system. So you can't, these elites, they're interested in development. And so when they get together in these conferences, they're not going to come up with a solution because they can't challenge the basis of the problem, which is capitalism. Not capitalism, I'm going to stop using the abstraction, capitalist. These are real concrete people who make these decisions. It's not a system that does it, it's not some abstraction. They're real concrete people. They have an option. They don't have to do it. They can say, I'm not going to live off profit anymore because it's destroying the earth. I'm going to do something else. But they insist on, and we shouldn't blame the institution. I heard a talk by Chomsky just the other day, and he said, well, they're trapped in these, it's an institutional power structure, and within the institutions, they have to do what, well, they don't have to do. They could leave the institution, right? They could say, I'm not going to do this. But if they're going to stay capitalist, they have to do it. So, their choice is to stay capitalist. If they're going to stay capitalist, they have to make profit, and they have to find new markets, or else their company goes under. So, okay, so that's the first conceptual clarification. In fact, most countries in the world are not on the road to development at all. They have been and are still being systematically and deliberately underdeveloped by the core capitalist countries. All right, now the second clarification is capitalism is the name for an entire social order, not just an economy. This mistake pervades our discourse on this issue, on every issue. We talk about the capitalist economy. It's not a capitalist economy. The nation-state system is an integral part of capitalism and always has been. There were states before capitalism, but capitalists came along and they took over the states and turned it into their own purposes. So this is where we get to anarchy, because even the scholars who recognize that capitalism is part of the problem are not anti-state, because they separate the state from the so-called economy. All right, now with those clarifications in mind, we'll talk about what happened in Copenhagen in December 2009. Well, they were all there trying to come up with a new binding treaty. By the way, a binding treaty is not really binding because there are no enforcement mechanisms in the treaty. I mean, I don't think. And so they just don't have to do it. But anyway, the United States came and they sabotaged both the procedure and the substance of the conference. What they did is they floated what they called an accord, and it was done outside of the UN process. So the UN process at least is supposed to be transparent and inclusive. So they sabotaged it, and they wrote up this agreement with 5 other nations. And so the whole thing in December in Copenhagen failed. It was a disaster. And so the 100,000 people out in the streets, they didn't get anything. And so what happened a year later in Cancun? Well, the protesters were much less. I mean, there were some peasant groups and farmers, and they were strong, but they were kept away from miles away. They couldn't even get close to that Moon Hotel on the beach, that luxury hotel where the conference was. They were stopped way. So the protest, that was different. And what happened, though, is that the United States this time managed to get all of the governments of the world to sign on to this separate accord, which is outside of the Kyoto Protocol, non-binding, based on voluntary claims that we'll do this and we'll do that. So they've succeeded, and their hope strategy has been to destroy the Kyoto Protocol, which is binding agreements to reduce the emissions. This is so ridiculous. Any government could reduce emissions just by saying, okay, they pass a law against it. But they're trying to do it through the stock market. I haven't explained that, but I should. Yeah, I should explain cap and trade. I'm almost finished, so. Cap and trade is a scheme invented by Wall Street. Here's how capitalism works. You have to turn everything into a commodity. Capitalists try to turn everything into a commodity. So Wall Street came up with a scheme to turn carbon rights into a commodity so they can be traded on the market. So cap and trade is a scheme that the government will put a cap on the amount of carbon dioxide you can emit, and then they lower that over the years. And then if a company does better, they can sell what they did better to people who did worse. And this gets traded on the stock market, and the stockbrokers make money. It is so ridiculous, it's unbelievable. And then they have an offset thing too. They can go to third world countries that have rainforests that they're not cutting down, and they can say, okay, we're not cutting this down, so that's a carbon credit. And then they can sell these carbon credits to people in the developed world who are exceeding their carbon emissions thing. Okay. So, I'll deal with the two other forces, and then we'll come back. I should say a thing about peak oil. Local initiatives. Okay, I went to the Cambridge Emergency Congress, and they didn't talk about corporations either. This was a bunch of Cambridge liberals. I'm telling you, don't tell me I said that. There were even people at this conference who, when I called attention to the fact that, well, what about the corporations? And they said, oh, yeah, that's true. We should get them on board, too, because they could really help us out. They thought that, So I kept pushing. I said, well, what actually, who burns the most energy in Cambridge? And so nobody knew, and we went scraping around. Finally, we got this one guy who had the data. And he said, well, 70% of all energy burnt in Cambridge is from industry and universities and government, the big institutions. And but the whole conference was focused upon the 30% of the residential. See, so they just couldn't deal with the corporation. Reminds me of a talk that several years ago at the LPC, these two guys came through. They had written a book on the damnation. It was about dams. And the whole hour was on how we could save water. And after the thing was over, I was a little puzzled. Well, you didn't mention corporations, and what's going on here? I mean, don't they use water? And he said, actually, 90% of water use is from industry and agriculture, and only 10% is domestic. And I said, how come you're focusing on the 10%? And I went up to 90%. He said, they don't listen. I thought that was so funny. I see humor in the strangest places. So anyway, okay, so local initiatives. Okay, here's the thing. The statistic I showed you before on the sources of CO2, electricity generation, industry, agriculture. And of course they leave out the military. The Pentagon is one of the biggest consumers of oil in the world. And if you add up all of the militaries in the world, I'm sure it's a huge amount of CO2 being produced in just the armies and navies and air forces of the world. That statistic doesn't get in there. So my claim about local initiatives, and this is a real wet blanket. People who know me, I have a reputation in Boston of being a wet blanket thrower. And this is the mother of all wet blankets, this global warming. But can global warming be stopped at the local level? No, it cannot. Tens of thousands of towns and cities could do everything in their power to reduce their carbon footprints, and it would not make much difference as long as the great engines of capitalist industry, agriculture, transportation, government, and military are still running. And I think this is true. Most cities, they would have to control these things. Okay, that's local initiatives. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do, well, I am. I'm saying that we should focus on, we got to figure out a way to attack the system. Okay, the final one is the global justice movement. Well, here are the problems. First of all, they're broke. Anti-capitalists are broke all the time. Here's a good example. Look at this book, this beautiful book. It's just unbelievable, graphs and photographs. This is Al Gore's book on global warming. He mobilized hundreds of people to do this. So that's the ruling class. Here we are. So how do we compete with this? It's just, okay, so where was I? Oh, the global justice movement. Okay, there are thousands of NGOs. Oh, that's the next big problem. We know about NGOs, right? There's a lot of good work now saying that NGO is just a friendly face of capitalism. Most NGOs, they're funded through the corporate foundations and all kinds of stuff. So in Cancun, in Copenhagen, they were all there, the Earth International Mobilization for Climate Justice, Rainforest Action Network, Climate Crisis Coalition, Climate Justice Action, Greenpeace International, Rising Tide International. Now, some of these are more radical than others. Some of them are quite radical. Mostly they don't focus on anti-capitalism. However, there was a climate justice in Tiquipaya, Bolivia last April, close to Copacabana. It was a village outside of Copacabana, and there was 30,000 people there, and most of them were probably anti-capitalist. And they went to Cancun. They wrote up a program. They went to Cancun, tried to get it into the discussion. They failed. It was just totally excluded. So the global justice movement is outside the process, and they'd have no money. And it's a question of whether they can actually stop capitalist industry, agriculture, transportation, military, and government. All right, so this brings me to what it would take and whether it's possible. Well, maybe I should back up to, what time is it? I started at 1:30, it's 2:20. Okay, 10 more minutes, and then we have a discussion. I haven't mentioned peak oil. Everybody knows what peak oil is, right? We're in the radical group here. Probably we've already passed peak oil. The latest research that I've seen was 104 to 108. 2004 to 2008, there was a leveling off plateau of oil production, and the last 2 years it's declined. So we've probably already passed peak oil. Peak oil means that the world production of oil has reached its limit, and thereafter it's going to decline. And how fast and how far is debatable, but all the cheap oil is gone. There's still oil, but it'd be more expensive. So this is going to have an unbelievable impact. I mean, the whole civilization is based on oil. And we can't deal with this because we don't have any control of decision making. The ruling class does. They're denying it. And it's just, so we need to add that to the climate change thing. It's a pretty dire situation. Now, is there possibility of a split in the ruling class? The first book I read on global warming was actually some time ago. It was Ross Gelbspan's first book called Heat is On. And he thought that the ruling class would split and that a lot of big corporations would get on board to stop global warming, like the insurance companies, because they're going to be wiped out, and so forth. But that hasn't happened, and I don't think it will. Now, there are a lot of companies that are trying to make money off of global warming. They're building huge wind farms and solar panels, but this is within the framework of a market economy and commodities. So there's those two things to consider. Now let's entire global social order known as capitalism. It is not difficult to map out a long-term solution. An entirely new civilization must be built. This will be a decentralized world without borders, without states, with production for use, not profit, based on cooperation, mutual aid, without wage slavery, money, markets, or hierarchy, a self-governing global social order based on direct democracy. In other words, anarchy. Peter Gelderloos has just written a new piece called The Anarchist Solution to Global Warming. And he comes to the same conclusion. He maps, basically, this is a little essay mapping out sketching out what an anarchist society would look like. It's good. I urge you to read it. So this is the extraordinary task we face. We, meaning the world's ordinary people, all people, not just indigenous people. We must take decision-making away from the ruling class and restore it to our households, workplaces, and communities. We must decommodify everything and reassemble ourselves socially. An entire social order, a global civilization organized on the basis of profit-mongering, must be defeated in the next 20 to 30 years, or else we will all die, not just human beings, but every living creature on Earth. We no longer have the option of going back to barbarism and starting over. This is a famous socialism or barbarism thing. You know, if we fail now and it collapses, we can start over. That option has been eliminated by global warming. Our only option now is anarchy or death. This is a powerful incentive. This will be our last and perhaps best chance to break the stranglehold capitalists have had on us for 500 years, to create a new society and save ourselves and life on Earth. Can this be done? Quite frankly, I don't see how. But we must try. It will require, this is the thing, this is our opportunity. It could be done. We've got to try and shoot for it. It would require an unprecedented, massive global anti-capitalist, including anti-statist movement. There are tentative signs that such a movement is emerging and gathering steam, as was perhaps indicated a bit by the climate conference in Bolivia in April. We all must do everything in our power to strengthen and build this movement. It's our only hope. So I think that's true. I think anarchy is the only way it will be stopped, but it's the time element. Can it be done in the time span we have? It could be done if we could get a massive enough global movement. there are things that could be done to give us a little more time, like one of the main campaigns that James Hansen pushes is to stop burning coal for electricity generation. So it turns out there are 2,300 coal-fired plants in the world, 622 in China and 600 or so here. If you could just get those two governments not to burn coal to generate electricity, it would drastically reduce CO2. But what are the chances of that happening? Both countries are controlled by savage capitalist ruling classes. And so, but still, that's something to shoot for. But to get out of fossil fuel-based economy is such extraordinary things would have to happen. I have a list in here, and that the things that would have to happen, and they're totally incompatible with capitalism. It would require, in addition to clean energy, massive conservation problems, a return to sustainable organic farming, just all kinds of things that can't be done under capitalism. So that's it. I'm sorry to bring the. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. Hello again. It's not often that one has a chance to add some corrections to a speech, but my friend who's editing this tape for me, agreed to film this a little bit. Unfortunately, there was an omission and a mistake and a misrepresentation in the talk, so I thought I'd add just a couple minutes to correct this. The omission was in laying out the facts of the case. I forgot to actually say what the amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere were. So this was the current level is 390 parts per million, and the consensus in the scientific community is that anything over 350 is not sustainable. So they want to get it back down to 350. But actually, the CO2 in the atmosphere is increasing 2 parts per million per year. So in 20 years' time, that would be 40 more parts per million. That would be 430 parts per million. This is what we're dealing with. And also, that's the current rate of increase. It'll probably speed up if things keep going the way they are. Okay, the mistake was that in the Cancun Accord, there was one nation that refused to sign it, Bolivia. So the United States didn't get every nation, every government in the world to sign on to that accord. But Bolivia refused. Now, the main reason I wanted to do this is because I left the impression in the talk that the methane emissions from the frozen tundra and the ocean hasn't started yet. At one point I said the question is whether this will happen and how fast, but it has already started. There are regular reports coming out of Canada and Russia about methane release. So the question is, how fast is it going to increase with the rise in temperature? But it is already well underway. I saw a short clip not long ago. Some scientists in Russia were in Siberia in a small shell pond, and they punched a hole in the ice and they lit the gas that was escaping. It was like turning on a cigarette lighter or something, turning on a stove. They were burning the escaping methane gas. So that's the main, and the whole paper, of course, is based on this methane release. While I'm at it, I might say that I wish I had, at the end, talked more about the strategies that for building an anti-capitalist movement and There is one great strategy that has not yet been tried, anarcho-communism, but I've dealt with that in another talk and in a paper, and so we'll have to save that for later. But it is a window of opportunity for us in terms of trying this strategy to defeat capitalists. As I said in the talk, though, the question is the time span. So thank you again for listening.